Good afternoon, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here with you today. It's, a great pleasure to represent Turkey. First, we're very grateful to Lady Mayor for hosting us in such a great venue. Let me start with a simple point. Over the past decade, climate discussions have been mainly about ambition. I think it's time to talk about delivery. Most countries have ambitious targets. They have strategies and transition plans. The real question is whether these can be implemented at the speed and the scale required. So that's really the key challenge. That's why these type of gatherings are important. And I believe there is no better place to have these conversations than in London, because London is one of the world's leading centers of not only finance, but also innovation. So this afternoon, I'd like to focus on two issues that will largely determine whether the transition succeeds: finance and private sector participation. Let me start with finance. The economic case for climate action is quite clear. If we fail to address climate change, the cost will be enormous. Most studies suggest that the cost of inaction is many times greater than the cost of preventing a climate disaster. In other words, climate action is not about, or not just about, protecting the environment. This is not an ideological movement. It's about protecting growth. It's about stability. It's about prosperity. The challenge, as I've highlighted earlier, however, is mostly financing. Developing countries outside of China need roughly about $2.5 trillion annually by 2030 to meet their climate goals. Yet, when we look at the current flows, it only amounts to about $200 billion. In other words, we are still operating at a far below the scale required. The financing gap is really not about lack of capital. Global savings are abundant. Institutional investors alone in the UK, they manage tens of trillions of dollars. The real challenge is mobilizing that capital at scale and directing it towards investable climate opportunities. So closing this gap has to be done, and that's why closing this gap is one of our top priorities during COP31. Climate risk is no longer a risk in the far distant future. It's already an imminent economic risk. And the problem doesn't stop at national borders. Climate shocks travel across economies and financial systems. So today, when we look at it, only about a quarter of climate-related losses are insured. The rest, the cost of the rest risks ultimately are borne by households, businesses, and governments. That's why climate risk is increasingly a sovereign risk. And sovereign risk, in turn, becomes a source of financial instability. The good news is that we already know much about what is holding private capital back. So we know what's holding investors back. Investors consistently point to obstacles such as a shortage of bankable projects, a lack of sound regulatory frameworks, and high perceived risk, in particular in emerging markets. So we need a climate finance architecture that is simpler, faster, and more effective. We need to lower cost of capital. We need to expand access to private finance. We need public institutions, multilateral development banks, and of course, private investors to work together and effectively. So we're not starting from scratch. I think a lot of progress has been made. At COP29 in Baku, countries have agreed on a new climate finance goal of $300 billion annually by 2035 and established a pathway towards mobilizing $1.3 trillion from all sources. At COP30 in Belém, leaders agreed to triple adaptation finance by 2035. The question now is how to turn those commitments into results. This is where Turkish COP31 presidency hopes to make some progress, some contribution. Our focus is not on creating new institutions or adding complexity to an already crowded landscape. Our focus is on helping the existing system to work more effectively and deliver. This is often about addressing the disconnect between financing needs on one side and available capital on the other. This is precisely the challenge that the Climate Implementation Bridge seeks to address. The objective is straightforward. We want to help countries transform their climate priorities into investable pipelines and connect those pipelines with financing opportunities. It's not a new fund. It's not a call for establishment of yet another financial institution. Rather, it's a practical effort to bring together governments, development partners, financial institutions, and investors in a way that help projects move more quickly from concept to financing and from financing to actual delivery implementation. We hope private sector will play an active role in shaping and supporting Turkey's efforts. None of these initiatives will succeed without you, without private sector. That's why my message today is very simple. We need your engagement. One of our priorities this year is electrification. Recent energy shocks have reminded us, once again, that energy security, affordability, and sustainability can no longer be treated separately. Against this backdrop, we have launched a global conversation on accelerating electrification and proposed a goal of increasing electricity share in our primary energy, final energy consumption from about 20% to 35% by 2035. This is quite ambitious, we know, and I think this is, again, a necessity. It's not about politics, it's simply Econ 101. Electrification will only succeed if it is accompanied by rapid expansion of clean energy supply and if developing countries can have access to the financing, technology, and infrastructure needed to make this transition. Otherwise, we risk creating new divides rather than closing or addressing existing ones. And our agenda extends well beyond electrification. We are also focusing on areas such as waste, cities, oceans, and youth engagement. Each presents opportunities for innovation, investments, and partnerships. And each requires the expertise and dynamism of private sector. To strengthen that engagement, we have launched COP31 Business Forum this week, with the Union of Chambers and Commodity Exchanges of Turkey serving as private sector representative. The forum will meet during Climate Week in New York and again in Antalya during COP31. We will also host Istanbul Climate Finance Week in September, bringing together all stakeholders to focus on practical solutions to the barriers that continue to limit climate finance. Let me conclude. The world is not short of commitments. What it needs now is implementation. And implementation requires partnership. So I invite you to engage with our priorities, contribute with your ideas and expertise, and join us in Antalya this November. If we can turn ambition into investments, investments into action, we will have done something that truly matters. Thank you.